Mental models. Why do we see the world differently? Sometimes we see the world differently because of our different circumstances or our different privileges, such as this cartoon here. Of course, this big fish thinks the world is just, and the little fish has a very different perspective. Sometimes we see the world differently because we have learned and developed differently. This is more the type of seeing differently that we are going to talk about. The difference between knowing more as opposed to seeing differently. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. One of my favorite quotes by Marcel Proust. So we're going to look at two main types of learning. Technical learning, which could also be considered instrumental, or transformative learning. We're actually not going to look at technical learning. We're just going to note that that is the vast amount of learning that goes on in our schools, in our organizations, when we learn how to do a new job. We learn new skills, we learn new knowledge. Today, we're mostly going to look at transformative learning. Learning is essentially change. When we learn something, we change. There are three types of change that come from learning. We might change what we know, the content of what we know. We might change a process of how we do something. Transformative learning involves a premise change. We start to question, what's the reason we're doing this in the first place? Transformative learning involves how adults learn to think for themselves rather than act on socialized beliefs, values, feelings, and judgments. A major perspective shift. I'll keep using that word, perspective, seeing new perspectives, and questioning assumptions. We generally walk through the world with assumptions. That's one of the shortcuts our brains take. We do not question or notice that at every moment of the day, essentially, we're making an assumption. When we turn on the sink, we're assuming that the water is going to come out. Transformative learning begins with a disorienting dilemma. Now check out this cartoon. We have a giraffe here that's having a disorienting dilemma. Apparently all his life he thought he was a sheep. He was hanging out with sheep. And all of a sudden, he sees another giraffe and realizes, oh my goodness, am I not a sheep? This is why it's called a disorienting dilemma, because his whole life is probably about to change once he accepts the fact that he is not a sheep. Now, interestingly, just having a disorienting dilemma doesn't mean we're going to learn or experience transformative learning. This giraffe could be in denial and decide that it's much easier to just go back to pretending he never saw another giraffe and that he is a sheep. And people do that their whole lives. But if he does start on the transformative learning journey, he will start taking these steps that Jack Mezirow, the creator of transformative learning theory, started to lay out. Step 2 being a self-examination. Step 3 is a critical reflection of assumptions. This giraffe will start to critically reflect on the fact that, he assumed he was a sheep, but maybe he's not. And then recognizing that others have a similar experience. Let's look at these further. The importance of reflection is really evident in those steps that I just showed you. John Dewey's famous quote, "There is no learning without reflection," is not a comment on technical or instrumental learning. It's on this larger type of learning, transformative learning. Here are more of these steps. We just looked at the first 4 steps of transformative learning. I'm going to tell you a story that will explain these various steps. It has to do with a man who belonged to a church. It was the Mormon church. I used to live in the Utah area. There was a very strong community of Mormons, and Mormons have not just a church, but really a way of living, a mental model that goes far beyond just going to church, but a whole society that they belong to. And this man had a son who had come of age. He was 20, and his son came out to him and told the father that he was gay. Now, if you know anything about the Mormon religion, or if you're Mormon yourself, you can imagine this was a very disorienting dilemma for this man, because homosexuality goes against the beliefs of the Mormon church. And so it's disorienting because all of a sudden our beliefs, it's disorienting because either at this point he kind of has to belong to the Mormon church or he has to accept his son, and those two things don't go together. So it's a very uncomfortable experience. The next stage of transformative learning is a self-examination, and this is usually with strong emotions, often emotions of guilt or shame. We realize we have been or we've been doing something wrong our whole lives. So in this case, this father did step beyond the disorienting dilemma and started to examine himself and his beliefs, and he had some very strong emotions. And then he entered the stage of critical reflection of assumptions, viewing the assumptions that he's had his whole life that homosexuality was wrong, looking at the beliefs of the church, critically reflecting upon them. Now, to get through this stage successfully, we need dialogue. We need other people. We need to talk this through. We need to think out loud. We need to conceptualize. And then this stage, recognizing others have a similar experience. So this man at this stage realized that there are other Mormons who've had this experience, certainly, of either realizing they're gay or finding out that they have someone in their family who is gay. And as you can imagine, this stage is very important for moving through the transformative learning experience, because once we realize that others have a similar experience to us, that gives us more courage to move on. We also can learn from them. And that involves this next stage, planning and acquiring skills to take on a new role. So this father actually joined a support group, and in that support group was able to learn from other people who'd gone through a similar experience, acquire the skills to take on a new role of someone who was both a part of the Mormon Church, which he hoped to remain, and also had a son who was gay or homosexual that he could accept in his family. And he had to learn actual skills and plan this out. How would he do this? Because in the Mormon Church, you're actually not supposed to be a part of the church if you're doing something so much against the church. And then experimenting with a new role. So he began to experiment with his new role of accepting his son, and then finally actually reintegrating into society with a new role and a new perspective. Now, in this case, it turned out he ended up deciding he was not able to be a part of the church and accept his son, and he left the Mormon Church. And so you can imagine took a lot of courage and involved a very new role that he had to take on, leaving behind everything he had identified with as a Mormon. So transformative learning is not to be taken lightly. It's not something that happens very often. Taking on a new role is not something we do very often. Or it might involve taking on, for instance, a new identity. It can feel like this. Like we're jumping off from one place, we're going somewhere new, we don't know exactly where we're going, yet we're leaving the old place behind, and there's no going back. Once we transform, we don't go back to the way we were before. Similar to a butterfly transforming from a caterpillar, the proverbial symbol of transformation. There's no going back. Maybe you wanted to stay in your cocoon. So to summarize, transformative learning involves processes that result in significant and irreversible changes in the way a person experiences, conceptualizes, and interacts with the world. That was a short overview of transformative learning. With that, we've been learning a lot. This might be a good point to stop, take a breath, check in with yourself, maybe just take a break, walk away from the computer, do something else, and come back, essentially turning this presentation into two parts. What is learning versus development? Learning, most of us probably assume we know what learning is. It's the acquisition of skills or knowledge, generally gained through experience or through being taught. Learning, again, involves some sort of change. Development is incremental growth toward greater self-knowledge, flexibility, inclusiveness, and complexity. This is a diagram of development, of developing greater complexity in the way one thinks in this case. If you are a teacher or a parent, you may be familiar with Piaget's stages of child development. You don't need to read the small text by any means, but these are the stages that children, babies to teenagers go through. This is very well researched. And again, there's no going back. Similar to transformative learning, once a child reaches the pre-operational stage, they don't go back to sensory motor. Once someone has formal operational thinking, they don't go back to being a concrete operational thinker. We gain more complexity. We don't go back to being simpler. You may be familiar with how research on Piaget stages was done. At the sensory motor stage, babies, if you put an object in front of them and then you cover that object up, in their mind, that object no longer exists. Peekaboo is so much fun because all of a sudden you pull the pillow away in front of your face and, oh my goodness, my mom is there. I didn't know that she was there. And over, they will not understand that the object has permanence and still exists, even if they cannot see it. And then at the pre-operational stage, a common research experiment is to put 2 equal-sized glasses of liquid in front of a child, pour one into a tall glass, and ask the child which one has more liquid or if they are equal. And the child will happily think she is smart and point to the taller glass as the one that has more. As we go through these different stages, our perspective increases. So as a child, we're focused on our needs. Some adults never leave this stage. But most adults reach a socialized stage where their relationships are a larger perspective. Instead of just seeing our needs, we see the needs of those around us. And then a larger, more complex, our standards and values, and basing our decisions, not just based on our relationships, but what we believe in. So this is one particular theory of human development. We used to think that adults did not continue to develop. Child development was it. Once we reach the formal operational stage, we're done. And now through Robert Kegan out of Harvard and many other researchers, we're aware that humans can continue to develop. They don't all continue to develop and become more complex, however. It takes effort and it takes opportunity as well. There's an article that I assigned to you, How to Be an Adult. It's a fantastic article. I hope you've already gotten to read it. It'll help all of this make more sense to you. And it explains Kegan's stages of cognitive or constructive development. So I will not explain them all here. Please read the article. But in those stages, you'll see that people transcend to a whole different level. They do not go back once they reach that level. And these X's here represent moments of transformative learning. So every time we have a transformative learning moment, those different shifts of mind can lead to a full new developmental stage. Jack Mezirow said, transformative learning is the engine of development. Here's another example of transformative learning being, building up. We can think of the water as all sorts of transformative learning experiences building up and then spilling over the dam, and we enter a new stage of development. This is from that article, How to Be an Adult, and it talks about these different stages according to constructive developmental theory that adults go through. Most adults, 58% of the population, according to Kegan's research, are at the socialized mind level. It says, I am my relationships, I follow the rules. Now, most of us might not think that we are in this stage, but this is pretty typical. We need validation from those around us. That's certainly a very common way of being. We need to belong to our groups. I explained earlier in the course that we're tribal people is how we evolved. If our group does not accept us, that is very scary. So most of us are at the socialized mind level. And then at self-authorizing level, we think for ourselves more individualistic. Our identity revolves around the way we think, and we're able to sort of look at the groups that we belong to and recognize that we might think differently. And this is a very, very difficult transition to make. It takes a lot of bravery, and people may risk, for instance, being kicked out of their family. Think about the boy who told his father, for instance, that he is gay. He was risking being kicked out of the group that he belongs to. 35% of the population is here, and it is strongly believed that in order to be a leader, for instance, of an organization, one needs to be at a self-authorizing conceptual level. And then this level, which is only 1% of the population, according to Kegan, is the transforming mind. And so at this stage, the person can see lots of different ways of thinking, lots of different worldviews. They can see various systems. This is a systems thinking level of being. And often when we develop, humans get a little proud of themselves and might look down on people at the previous level. But at this stage, there's more empathy and acceptance, and instead of looking down on other levels, is able to sort of see how other people operate and accept that with love and compassion. So generally, people who are evaluated to be at this level are people like both spiritual and political leaders, such as Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., people of that nature, according to Kegan's research. There's this concept from Kegan of when we move through these different developmental levels, what was subject becomes object. So at the instrumental level, we are subject to our needs and we really cannot see beyond our needs. But then as we move to socializing level, we recognize that, hey, I've got needs, but other people do. And now we can be objective about our needs. So in nonviolent communication, you're learning to be more objective about how your needs and your feelings and see relationships better. Nonviolent communication is a great tool for experiencing development through all these levels. So you might think of the subject-object concept as our concept of going to the balcony. When we're on the dance floor, we really cannot see much else, and that's great. It's fun. There's nothing wrong with that. But we have to go to the balcony if we're going to be able to see other people's perspectives and understand the larger systems that are going on. So that is transformative learning theory in a very quick nutshell, and how it affects our development and developmental theory, which in turn has a lot to do with our mental models. It's important to understand that as we develop, we gain greater self-awareness. And that self-awareness goes hand in hand with a new awareness of society. So this all transfers over to changing our organizations and changing a society, how we see the world and our effect on it. One advanced concept that I'll share with you if you're interested is spiral dynamics. This was theory that was laid down by Don Beck and has been popularized by Ken Wilber. And this is essentially saying that as people develop in groups, that it affects whole groups of people and the way they see the world and operate. And generally, at this level is called a tribal level or magical animistic. Here we are. People are part of tribes. We always will have that mental mindset of having a tribal way of being. And then this is sometimes called a warrior level, red, impulsive, egocentric. I am most important, and whoever is dominant, whoever might is right, whoever is strongest and most powerful has their way and should have their way. That's the general belief. We see a lot of this going on in politics today, a tribal mentality, a belief in dominance. And then at this authoritarian level, or blue, you could think of this as being traditional. Now I think of my father at this level. He was a blue-collar worker, and he believed in his organization. He follows the rules in society. He generally repeats things that other people say. He's a wonderful person who is a great contributor to his society, to his church, to his organizations. And then at this level, it's called the achievist here, orange. I like to think of this as like the corporate, like the CEOs. This is sort of modern society. So the mid-20th century, it was when this became more popular, that those who deserve merit are those who are smartest. And then at this green level is communitarian, it's called here. This is a sense that we're all connected. We need to take care of each other. We need to take care of the environment. And then systemic, holistic, and so on. Now, it's interesting to note that at these different levels, you have one that's more, this side is more communal. This side is more individualistic. So as society, as different groups of people develop through these different types of ways of thinking, they flip-flop between being more communal, more individualistic, more communal. So here at the tribal, that's communal. And then we have this dominant, might is right, warrior. And then we have the traditionalist who works hard for his organization and his group. And then we have the individualistic. And then we have the communal, and then the systems thinker who can think for themselves and look out upon all of these different levels and integrate all of them. Now, some people, of course, do not like this theory at all because it can seem incredibly elitist, but I thought I'd share it with you. Some people find it incredibly interesting. And so to round this out, we will go back to Senge. A shift in mind is the title of, I think it's chapter 4, Evolving Worldviews and Paradigms. So the point of this is to understand that when people have different views or different mental models, we often, don't even understand they have a different mental model because it takes a lot of self-development to even understand that other people see things different ways, fundamentally different ways. Or we think that their different views simply come from the way they grew up or their personality or their disposition, and that could certainly be true. But we want to understand that often people have mental models because they're at different levels of development or different levels of complexity. And especially if we're a leader, we need to meet people where they're at. And if we want to move our organization from an industrial age model to an information age or an integrated model, we need to understand these different perspectives. And it is not easy to transform, it's very scary, from one perspective to another. Hopefully this class will help you make some of those transformations for yourself and for those around you.